Things are going to start happening to me now.
You've done all the reading. You're a scholar, you're a professor. You've done all the reading. You've done the intellectual heavy lifting.
More or less, eat shit and die.
You wouldn't know a fact if it begged you all night long.
Want to give the wrong impression, because I am very high.
Ran up behind him with a hatchet. Smash, smash, smash.
Yeah. Care. I'm a libertarian. What I'm getting is,
Did you vote for Joe Jorgensen or Trump?
Who?
Joe Jorgensen.
That was the perfect answer. Thank you.
Oh boy, welcome everybody to the Libertarian Podcast Review. This is Tyler Yonke. We've got Garbage Man Andy, but more importantly, we have Stephan Kinsella. He is very well known in the libertarian sphere and to us. So welcome, Stephan. I hope I said your name right.
You did. Glad to be here. I like your opening.
Yeah, it is one of my favorites because there's a lot of good little nuggets there, especially the famous one there with Alex Jones. So what do you think? Alex Jones, libertarian or not?
I don't know a lot about it, but I don't see any reason to believe that he's libertarian.
Did you recently see his thing with Steven Crowder talking about why libertarians are not good?
No.
Okay.
But I'm not surprised.
We won't go into too much of it. Andy and I did break that one down. Why don't you first tell everybody who you are, all your bona fides, and then we'll go on from there.
All of my bona fides.
All of
How
them.
much time do you have?
Well, I'm going to link to all your stuff, your Substack, your website, your Liberty Papers.
I did just start a Substack, and Jeff Tucker's urging. We'll see how that goes. I'm Stephan Kinsella. I'm an attorney in Houston, kind of basically a retired attorney at this point. And I write and speak on libertarian legal theory from an Austrian anarchist perspective. So that's who I am. And I'm involved with the Mises Institute and Hans Hermann Hoppe's group in Turkey. And I've been doing this for over 30 years.
You just were over in Turkey, is that correct?
Yeah, I went to the 16th annual meeting in Bodrum, Turkey for Hoppe's group.
So a few things. One, how was that, and what did it all entail? And then how was travel over to Turkey with all the COVID stuff we've got going on, the wars in the world? How was travel?
Well, so it was really good. It was maybe the best one ever from my point of view because I stayed a few extra days because my son is old enough where I don't have to rush back home. So we had a lot of extra time to do side trips. We had to cancel the conference in 2020 because of COVID, because no one could get there. So we had it last year, like a truncated version. It was a smaller group because it was still difficult to get there. This year, things were back on schedule. So the only problem was that inflation is crazy in Turkey right now. So, as an outsider, it doesn't hurt that much because your dollar goes a little bit farther. But I don't know, things seem roughly the same. Every year you go to Turkey, you're worried there's a tense situation because of the conflict between the U.S. and Turkey, and the Islamicists who want to take over there. But I don't know. I've been going like 12, 13, 14 years in a row, so I've enjoyed it. I like it.
Why is the conference in Turkey? What makes Turkey the place that the hotbed for this?
Well, it's just a strange coincidence. And in 2006 or 5, Hans Hermann Hoppe remarried. He married this woman, Gülçin Emre, who is an Austrian economist herself, but she's a Turkish woman, and she has an estate in Istanbul and also in Bodrum. Her family has a hotel there. And so Hans married her and started the PFS in 2006 and decided to hold it at his wife's hotel. So we basically have it in Turkey because his wife has a hotel there that we can hold the event at. And interestingly, he did it as a counterpart to the Mount Pelerin Society, which is sort of this original classical liberal group started in the 1940s by Hayek and Milton Friedman and these guys. And, you know, there's a famous story about Mises storming out of one of the meetings saying, you guys are a bunch of socialists because, you know, by mainstream lights, these were all the classical liberals at the time, but they were all basically on board with, you know, you have to have a social welfare program. You have to have, you know, social welfare, you know, all the programs. And Mises just was like, what the hell, man? You guys are on the road to serfdom, as Hayek would later, you know, write about. So anyway, Hoppe wanted to form a more radical version of that, an international law, an international society dedicated towards Austro-libertarian anarchist principles, not just classical liberal. And so because it was going to be inaugurated in Bodrum, Turkey, which is not too far from a very famous mountain called Mount Ararat, right? Which is where allegedly, you know, Noah's Ark was found and all this kind of stuff. So it's very biblical. So we were going to name it the Mount Ararat Society as a counterpoint to the Mount Pellerin Society, but we decided that sounded too Old Testament.
So what did you or Hans ben Noah in that scenario?
Interesting question.
All right, good. I'm glad we stumped you. Look, let's read the Minder.
You stumped me. You stumped me on that one.
Everyone knows who Kinsella is, and if they don't, they should probably physically distance themselves immediately from the show. Which takes me to the next. Okay, I like it. Which takes me to the next question. Maybe Andy, you can explain the thing with Rose on the internet to everybody, and which it comes to one of the things we want you to explain. I don't know why are you the designated Hans Hermann Hoppe spokesman for Twitter US?
I don't really know. Probably because Hans doesn't talk to people anymore, and so everyone turns to me because I defend him when he's unfairly criticized and maligned. I am my own guy.
Yeah.
But I run his website and I run the PFS website, and I've helped him out over the years. And I've been a big proponent of his argumentation ethics and his earlier praxeological and proprietarian work. But the funny thing is, you know, he's really gotten more attention because of his later kind of his cultural work, like democracy and immigration and that stuff, which I never wrote a lot about, really. But everyone sort of comes to me and they tar and feather me with his ideas on this, which some of them I still defend. I mean, not all of them necessarily, but I mean, so I don't know. I guess it's because I have the tenacity to stand up and defend the guy because I don't have any compunction about doing so. I will defend anyone who I agree with, even if I don't agree with everything they believe.
Andy.
Well, as far as I know from the Rose thing, so there is the helicopter meme, and it started as a meme and really just an inside joke, but some people buy into it and think that the NAP and libertarianism are divisible. And from what I could tell, she was really misrepresenting Hoppe's work and talking about physical removal as far as like being acceptable in terms of property rights violation. Like it's okay to violate someone's property rights if you disagree with them or they're a communist or whatever. But from my understanding is when Hoppe has talked about this, he means social ostracization. Like you can physically distance yourself, you can buy their property from them, or, you know, there is some level of cooperation, but he's not talking about actually throwing people out of helicopters.
Yeah, well, he's actually explicitly clear about that. Michael Malice actually talked to him when he came to the PFS a few years ago. And, you know, he said, when you say physically remove, do you mean like remove as a verb? Or do you mean like add a remove? And Hans says, I just mean add a remove. Like he just means like, I think all Hans is talking about, see, Hoppe talks in these German kind of categorical idealistic ways where he goes to extremes to illustrate a point. And so I think he imagines right away the extremes of a situation to illustrate something. So he basically is saying that people in society tend to affiliate and segregate voluntarily with each other. This is just, we all know this, right? There are different segregated areas of society. Like tends to go with like and whatever. Doesn't mean there can't be some trade, some intercourse and all this stuff, but people do tend to segregate. And I think all Hans was saying was he predicted that if you have a private law society, you would have regions or associations of people, and they would tend to have commonly shared values. And those would, in his view, in most of these groups, would tend to be the kind of heterosexual, Western, private law, private property based society. Now, he didn't mean by that everyone had to be heterosexual or whatever. What he meant was that would be like the norm. Yeah, but if you have like a neighborhood and you have a priest, the priest is celibate. He's not like ostracized because he's a priest, but he's not out there criticizing the institution of marriage and children. Like,
and he's not the norm as far as like the population.
He's not the norm, and that's fine. But the point is, he's tolerated because he recognizes that that's the predominant mode.
Right.
And so I think Hans says, okay, so you're going to have people that tend to be basically libertarian or private property oriented and conservative in the sense of like, respect authority, respect your parents, have manners, that kind of stuff. And so people that come into town and they're just spouting all this stuff like opposed to that, communists, radicals, people that just hate everything about your society, they're going to tend to
call them outlaws, right?
Well, they don't have to necessarily commit a crime, but even if they don't commit a crime, they're not going to tend to be welcomed by this community. So yeah, Hans would never advocate expelling someone physically from their property. Property rights are sacrosanct in his view. Now, there are some libertarians I've been arguing with in recent days on Facebook, like David Beto and these guys, and they simply keep making things up about Hans, which is, look, if you're going to disagree with someone, that's fine, but just at least accurately state their position. So they keep saying, like, Hans believes that in today's world, we should expel racial minorities, like, which is not his view at all. He never says that at all. He simply says you shouldn't have a government policy that artificially changes the character of the country. But he says that in a private law society, you can everyone can invite whoever they want onto their property. So he says nothing like that whatsoever. So these people have to distort what he says to try to demonize him. And I guess this is why I'm called on to defend him, because I'm passionate about spending.
As a libertarian, right, you have to defend someone's right to discriminate for any reason or whatever reason. You don't have to necessarily agree with it, but
right.
Do you see
there's two sides that seem to be taking on Hoppe recently. So there's a lot that are taking him on, even some of the post-libertarian types, and they kind of are, at least this is my reading, not too much into it, but almost using him as aggression is the NAP isn't necessarily, and we can remove people. And then the other side is like, we don't like Hoppe because he is saying to, use helicopters. So it almost feels like they're both misrepresenting him. One's trying to use him and one's trying to, for the good, for their side. And the other side is trying to use him as a negative. Am I reading that correctly or no?
I think there's something to that. I think the post-libertarians fixate on a few things that, further their cause. But anyone who's a post-libertarian, when I hear that, I think, ex-libertarian, used to be libertarian, want to be libertarian. So, they're basically just another type of socialist in my point of view. So they used to flirt with it and they, whatever. Now, the left libertarian, like the helicopter meme, Hans never said anything about helicopters. He simply said, people would not want to associate with people that don't share their values. And then that got turned into the Pinochet helicopter meme. And it also got turned into the snake meme, so there's a whole bunch of these alt-right kind of guys that have glommed onto this because the internet is a crazy and wacky and fun place. But Hans just watches it with bemusement from the sidelines. He has no responsibility for it, of course.
Do you have a personal favorite Hoppe meme?
Well, I like my ringtone on my phone is something. There's a podcast. What's the name of the guy that does a podcast? He's kind of an alt-right guy. Jared, someone.
Jared the Hoppian, or
Yeah, Hoppe and something, but he starts out with Hans as quote crush the anti-fascist mob. I like that, but no, Hans is a sweet, nice guy. I mean, it's just bizarre to me that you have these Pepe the Frog things and the snake things and the helicopter things.
Let's go into the Phil Magness stuff, if you don't mind. I know you wrote up. I subscribed to your Substack, by the way, so good stuff there.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. And I read the whole take. You did quite the deep Facebook posts, even between the two of you. So I'm not going to get into all of that, but I thought, and Andy and I had played this recently, and you've probably seen it. What kind of brought him to my attention? Now I knew about Phil because he did a lot of the work against this 1619 project, and I thought it was really good. And then I watched this, and my first comment to Andy was, when you see someone so almost dishonestly try to take this apart, it makes you wonder, was I hoodwinked into all his stuff on the 1619 project? Because if you're so bad on one item that I can easily check, what about those other ones? First of all, what's your feeling on him? And do you want to give an intro to the Phil Magness debate?
Well, I mean, I agree with your general point that, if someone says something that is so obviously unsupportable, it does make you trust their other stuff, distrust their other stuff. I'm not deep into his 1619 stuff. I assume that stuff is pretty good because he's been on Tom Woods so many times, and the times I remember hearing him, he was solid. But he's got on this hobby horse against Hans, and it started with these weird kind of pseudo-intellectual comments about Hans being overly influenced by the Frankfurt School and Jürgen Habermas, who's a famous European socialist philosopher. And it's like he thinks he's uncovered some kind of deep, dark secret because he did this amazing detective work of finding out that Hans Hermann Hoppe's PhD advisor is Jürgen Habermas, which has been made public for 30 years. I mean, this is not like something he found out. But there's just nothing to it. I mean, to his credit, Hans studied in Europe and he was a lefty intellectual. He studied under Habermas and these guys, but he actually grew out of it and became a Misesian, Rothbardian anarcho-capitalist. I mean, so it's just bizarre to try to pin his immigration views on Habermas, because it just makes no sense, because Habermas probably has more open borders views because he's a social democrat type. So it makes no sense. Hans admitted the couple times he drew on Habermas, which is a couple cases on, number one, his rationalism, which is the stuff that's good, which I don't see how Magness could disagree with it. But Habermas and this guy Appel, his sort of colleague, developed discourse ethics, and Hans did later on draw on that, but it's got nothing to do with his immigration views or his anything untoward. So I think the whole initial attempt to attack Hans by Magness was just incoherent. And there's no way he could back it up in some kind of coherent writing. He just rambled on the internet about it. But then he started when that didn't succeed, he started ratcheting up you're a racist, you're part of the Mises Institute, you're an anti-Semite, you're German. Oh, you quoted David Irving in one of your books. Oh, you must be horrible. Hey, didn't Phil Magness quote David Irving when he quoted Hans quoting David Irving? Right. I mean, are we going to play this stupid meta bullshit? I mean, fuck you.
That sounds like an argument I had with my wife last night. So not the fuck you part, but the other part. I'm gonna play some of this clip here because I think it's in kind of an important thing. But I think in your Substack, I tried to get to the motive, right? And you believe it's the anti-Mises caucus. Is that kind of your summation of why they're getting? Okay.
Yeah.
Andy, did you have anything before I start doing this?
Oh, I was just gonna say, Habermas is what Hans drew his argumentation ethics from, his discourse ethics. If I'm correct, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And then I think, to me, Magness it just kind of shows his personal in-group preference. I don't think he's understanding what Hans is saying whatsoever.
Okay, could be. All right, let me play. I know this is tough to watch on this. Let me know if you can't hear it, and we'll play a few minutes, and I'll stop and ask some questions.
Op-eds.
Yeah. Hans Hermann Hoppe
Yes.
is one of your, I was going to say he's one of your white whales.
Yeah.
I mean, he's certainly into whiteness. But,
That is certainly the case.
Hoppe.
Okay, I'm sorry to go stop this. Why is there a thing about him being into whiteness? What's the proof or the genesis to that kind of easy, off the cuff comment and laugh?
Well, I guess there's a couple things. There was a book that was going to be published by Chase Rachels, and he called it White, Right, and Libertarian. And actually, the substance of the book, for the parts I've read, is not bad, but like the title is just so seedy. And he was going to use Hans Hermann Hoppe's forward on that, and when Hans decided not to give him permission to use the forward, he had written a draft of the forward during an earlier version of the book, and but Chase Rachels decided he's going to publish the forward anyway. So he published the book with Hoppe's forward, even though Hans withdrew his permission. Excuse me, but even that's not like white. It's not like it's just. I think that book primarily makes the kind of the standard argument that all these affirmative action policies and the anti-discrimination policies, they end up demonizing white people, which I think is kind of hard to deny. Doesn't mean you have to be a white nationalist or think the whites are superior. When Hans has never written that at all. He did talk about how the white race was at the core of Western civilization, which is, again, simply a factual claim. I don't know if I'm not an expert enough to know if I agree with all that stuff, but it's not a racist claim. It's just simply talking about that. But he's never ever said anything like minorities have fewer rights. They should be removed or anything like that. So that's simply all made up. And he's simply a white guy himself, basically, is the problem. He's a German white guy. Right. So that's the problem.
Well, me as a German, I understand his plight. Now, you did mention he married a white nationalist from Turkey, right?
No, he married a Muslim Turkish woman, actually. Yeah. He's a big.
So there you go. She's obviously self-hating. Okay, we'll continue on there.
Who taught for years at University of Nevada, Las Vegas, was a protege of or a colleague of Murray Rothbard, and things like that. What's your beef with Hoppe, and is he somebody who needs to be critiqued more forcefully within the broad libertarian world?
Yeah, so Hoppe has strangely come to prominence as like this figure. He's seen as the designated heir of Rothbard, and as supposedly
who had designated himself as the heir of Mises, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And you argue that they fundamentally misread Mises.
That is absolutely the case.
Okay, what's the basis of that?
So the clearest is the question of immigration. Mises is a good, solid 19th century classical liberal, especially on immigration. And he is vehement in his opposition to immigration restrictions. Does so on all the classical economic arguments. This is a theme that runs through his text from the 1910s to basically when he dies. And Hoppe has tried to invent this kind of carved out counter narrative while still claiming to be a representative of Mises.
Okay, so this broke me when we first watched it, and I'll get back to it because the comment is he misread him, and then he's talking about having a different his own way about it, right? Which I think you've said, I have some disagreements. So you can have, I imagine, disagreements. That doesn't mean I'm misreading him, right? I mean, is Hoppe claiming that his way of immigration is the way that Mises is?
No, however, in liberalism, Mises basically does say something like, ideally you want open borders and free flow of people and goods and all this stuff, which is, by the way, the view of all of Hoppe as anarcho-capitalists in a private society. But he says something like, in a mass, welfare state or something, you couldn't sustain it. So even Mises in liberalism basically takes a position very similar to what Hoppe says. Not that endorses it or anything. I remember there was one incident about 15 years ago, another earlier nemesis. See, all these guys are like reincarnations of earlier loathsome people like Tom Palmer and Cato people. Tom Palmer used to have it out for Hoppe. And one time he attacked Hans for saying that he was a Misesian because he agreed with Mises that you can't have involuntary unemployment on a free market, or voluntary. Like, in other words, if you have unemployment on a free market, it's voluntary, because you can always have a market clearing price or whatever. It's just a standard free market argument.
Yeah.
And Palmer was attacking him because Palmer's sort of a Chicago kind of guy. He doesn't quite go all the way, blah, blah, blah. But the point was, Palmer attacked Hans for pretending to be a Misesian. And I wrote a response to him. I said, well, I'm not saying who's right or wrong. I said, but Mises said A, B, and C, and Hans is simply repeating what Mises said. So you can't say Hans is not a Misesian when he's actually repeating what Mises said. And Palmer's response was, oh, well, this is how you religious people do. You just quote the text. I'm like, I'm not quoting the text. I'm not quoting to prove that it's right. I'm saying that you're wrong to say he's not a Misesian. He literally is a Misesian because he's elaborating on what Mises actually said. You actually are not a Misesian. I'm sorry.
How much do you think you need to be okay, so is Hoppe really an Misesian? How would you say?
Absolutely,
or,
yeah. So
I actually, you can have divergence, right? And
absolutely.
To what extent is that still okay?
So I guess there's politics, there's culture, and social theory and economics. I think actually Rothbard was correct to say he was the heir of Mises, and I think Hoppe is right to say he's the heir of those two. And I think Hans basically blends sort of Kantianism, a bit of Habermas with the argumentation ethics, and Mises, and then Rothbard. So I think he inherited Mises' methodology, like his radical a priori stuff and his praxeology. And he got the radical politics from Rothbard, because Rothbard was an anarchist and way more radical, in political terms, than Mises was. So, of course, yes, he's clearly directly building upon Mises and Rothbard. I would say more, in a sense, more Mises than Rothbard. But then he added his own stuff, because Mises and Rothbard were both, as Hans said in the introduction to his democracy book, Mises and Rothbard both had what he called a soft spot for democracy, because, if you're Mises, you come to America from the Cold War and from totalitarianism, like Ayn Rand did, you're going to think America's a paradise because we have a constitution and we have some reverence for individual rights. So you're going to tend to place a lot of emphasis on, oh, these guys are amazing. They got it mostly figured out. But part of that is democracy. So you're going to start thinking, oh, well, the American Revolution and the French Revolution, but mostly the American Revolution and the move from monarchy to democracy was progress. Not perfect, but it was progress. So Hans says, let's wait a second on that stuff. Maybe Rothbard and Mises were a little bit, and Rand, all these guys, the earlier classical liberals and libertarians, maybe you're a little bit too willing to go into with the American scheme of things as being kind of the new model, It's the Francis Fukuyama bullshit, the end of history and the last man. We perfected things. We can perfect it a little bit more, but we finally reached the basic final form of history. And Hans is like, no, I think when we went from monarchy to democracy, we went backwards in many ways. And he explains this by economic arguments, like incentives, like, oh, the monarch has a better incentive to act more rationally with the property that the people have to use than Democrat leaders do. And it's basically it's a point you can't argue against. You could say that on balance, it's better to have democracy, like it's worth paying that price, but you can't deny that it's worse in some respects. So anyway, but my point is, he definitely took a lot of things from Mises and Rothbard, but he developed a lot of his own insights, his argumentation ethics, his more radical interpretation of praxeology and methodology, epistemology, his immigration views, his views on democracy. So yeah, he's his own guy, but he's built upon those two guys. But he's clearly the current best representative of Mises and Rothbard, in my view.
Do you think that since he likely, where they differ, he probably skews a little more to the right than Mises and Rothbard, or at least definitely than Mises? Now I'm not a well-read Hoppian, so would that be part of the problem of the reason types and Magness?
Well, he's made no qualms that he's a more culturally conservative, and especially but he has scathing critiques of American conservatives in a lot of ways that I think are misrepresented when people read Chapter 10 of Democracy: The God That Failed. They think it's an assail on what he calls modal libertarians, but it's really a critique of the American conservatives and people like Pat Buchanan attempting to use socialism to create culturally conservative outcomes. And Hoppe pretty much dispels that whole myth.
So is that why do you get pushback from here as well, similar to the Meacock thing?
I don't know. I hear from all sides, but I mean, he did criticize Richard Spencer and these guys specifically a couple years ago because basically they are economically, illiterate. They haven't learned their lesson, is the way he puts it. And by the way, I'm just trying to restate what I think Hoppe's view is. I don't consider myself to be a cultural conservative ogre, and I don't think Hans is either. I think what Hans does is he's trying to say that so he's got a really good article about I think it's called A Realistic Libertarianism. And me personally, I've always thought that the distinction between left and right was bullshit because I'm a libertarian, right? I think that, they're both socialists of different flavors.
Sure.
And also thought that the way that they're defined is incoherent. So for example, in America, let's say, and the left is basically a soft socialist. Now that's actually somewhat coherent, but it's not that coherent because if you're going to be a socialist, why not be a socialist? But the left is like soft socialism. Maybe as Michael Malice says, socialism going the speed limit or whatever. But the right in America is like a totally incoherent agglomeration of like three groups. So you have the moral majority Christian types,
Andy,
and then you have the neocons, the pro-war muscular American neocons, and then you have the Chamber of Commerce pro-business free market types. Now, in my view, the third group is the core, the good part of the Republican Party and the conservatives. But it makes no sense that you would have those three groups allied with each other. I think it's a temporary marriage of convenience, right? And so it's an unshaky alliance, but it's not a coherent doctrine. Conservatism doesn't make any sense. Just conserving. Now, it makes sense to a degree to say we have to recognize there's some wisdom in natural authority structures and traditions and all this stuff. So that's what Hoppe gets at in that essay. He basically says the essence of the difference between left and right is the left is essentially egalitarian, right, which is anti-life, anti-man, unrealistic. But the right is essentially realistic in the sense that we recognize the need for and the naturalness and the goodness of natural authority figures, elites, hierarchies, institutions, and society. And this is what the left and some left libertarians seem to fight against. But from my point of view, it's just simply obvious that we have a state right now, and the state does all these things that we think it either shouldn't be doing, like the drug war and inflation, or it should be letting private people do, like roads and prisons and the justice system and education and all this stuff, right? And so if you just get rid of the state tomorrow, you push a button and you get rid of it, you have a vacuum. There's obviously a need for roads and there's a need for authority figures. So if you don't have it filled by private institutions and actors, it's going to be filled by the state. That's what's happened. So you have a choice to make in life. Do you want private, natural authority figures and hierarchies and institutions, or do you want statist ones? That's the choice. And the left libertarians don't seem to recognize that because they're basically not realistic. They refuse to recognize that people are not the same and that everyone shouldn't have the same thing. And there's no injustice in some people having a better life than others because they're better people or whatever. It's really not that complicated, but they make it complicated because they've been given the blessings of capitalism even though they don't deserve it, but so they live this rich, spoiled life as an academic, and they don't have to face the wolves every day. And so they think, oh, nature's great. It's like, you dumbass. In nature, you'd be dead. You know? So anyway, that's my rant, but.
Well, I like it. I don't want to get back to this, but I'm sorry. I'm just going to deviate off it here a little bit. You made me think of a few things. One, so I don't know if you've watched it all. I know you're an attorney and you're retired, so you have plenty of time on your hands now. Have you watched or paid attention at all to the Darrell Brooks trial, the Waukesha in Wisconsin? Waukesha.
No.
Thank you. Okay.
No.
So this gentleman, he's a little crazy. He has decided to go down the sovereign citizen route. Okay. Yeah.
I know these types. Common law court nuts. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's been rough because one of the things he should be doing is being polite, but he interrupts all the time. So they've actually removed him. So he's trying to take the sovereign citizen. I feel like they're close, but they're not quite there. Right. Which is, okay, I get it. They are literally living in Kapistan or in sovereign citizen land. In reality, but reality isn't there with them. So none of the things that they want and they push are realistic. First of all, the 14th Amendment, he's pushing on that. What's your take on the 14th Amendment from a libertarian point of view?
Okay, I'll give you that. But let me say on these conspiracy nuts and the sovereign citizen people, I'm with them in spirit.
Yeah.
The problem is most of them are Protestants who believe in text, right? And your own vision of things. And they have this almost magical view of incantations. They think that the world is made of magical spells. And if you find the right spell that you can say in front of a judge, you can make him do your will. But that's just unrealistic. That's not how the system works. I mean, so they say like, oh, show me the law, where they have to pay income tax. But saying show me the law is just an incoherent rant by someone who's like a Kafka-esque victim of a system. But it's not going to work on the judges that are part of the system, right?
Yeah.
They don't have a realistic understanding of the These guys are not real. My point is, these guys that they're talking to, they're not really judges.
Yeah.
They're fake judges. So they don't care about justice.
Yeah.
Their job is to interpret the law as their fellow system interprets it, just to keep their place in society. So I feel sorry for these guys, but they have to recognize reality. It's like, poor Irwin Schiff died in prison, right? I mean, you can say your little theories all you want. And the ultimate problem is that they are legal positivists. Like, they think that law is what's written down on a piece of paper in black and white, partly because they've been influenced by the American experiment of having a written constitution. So all the Americans now think that law is what's written down on the law books.
Right.
The Constitution's written down.
I swear you watched it because you sound it's all the little.
Yeah, I know these guys. I know these guys.
Maybe you're a more experienced attorney than I am, but he keeps asking for the lawful law. Was that a lawful law?
and what they're grasping at is they're grasping at legitimacy, right? And their instincts are right. Like, the whole system is not legitimate. It's just a thing. But they think it's a real system of justice, and they think the judge's job. They think they're real judges and think their job is to do justice, but it's not. It's just to read the law that they're handed down by the superiors and apply it. That's it. It's not that different than what you have in Russia or in China right now.
Yeah.
These guys are not really justice organ. This is the whole reason we're anarchists. We want to have real systems of justice done privately, organically, not these fake things, right? So, your 14th Amendment question. So on the one hand, I'm a legal realist in the sense of I recognize that at a certain point, the positive law is what is enforced in a given jurisdiction at a given point. You can determine that and recognize that and identify that in a sort of empirical or factual process, regardless of legitimacy. So it is the fact that it's illegal to sell cocaine in Texas right now. I don't know.
Andy, is that true?
Well, doesn't stop him from doing it close to where I'm at here in San Antonio.
All right. So
and if you get to the point where law and order breaks down, where you can get away with it all the time, then it ceases to become a law. But we have ways of determining what we call the law, which is things that, and this is where I agree with Oliver Wendell Holmes, right? Like the prediction theory of law. Law is what you predict that the courts will probably do if you get hauled before a court, right? So it's very legal positivist, but the thing, a lot of natural law types, which is my side, they hate this type of thinking about it because they basically buy into what I think is legal positivism. In other words, they have this view that God announces what the law is. So they think if there's a source of law. Now, I would consent. I'm an atheist, but I would agree that if law is going to have a source, it's better to be this benevolent God than some committee of congressmen, right? So I agree it's an improvement, but still the conception they have is that law is whatever is pronounced by some powerful overlord, okay? Whether it be God or the angels or God's God, whoever that is, or the Congress, right? So when you think of law as that, you lose the connection to morality. So this is why the natural law types, they think it's got to be God, because at least God is going to be right. Like the commands he's going to issue, at least they're going to be guided by benevolence and omnipotence, right? And omniscience. So at least you know that the commands you have to obey on the penalty of going to hell, at least you know that it's a good guide to living your life the right way. And if you don't live it the right way, you're going to go to hell. But anyway, it's at least not totally as arbitrary as a bunch of congressmen, right? And so I think that what happens is people get so used to the idea nowadays in the last 200 years, not just in America, but in the West in general, with the rise of legal positivism and to democracy. And Hans Hoppe, to his credit, rightly calls this democratic lawmaking. In other words, legislation is democratic lawmaking. It's another way that democracy corrupts the ancient regime and the idea of natural law and the natural order. When you start thinking of law this way, you think of law as just these commands that the government can enforce, right? And so then you start thinking, well, if I could just say the right words. So it's almost like you're Doctor Strange in a Marvel movie. You have to say the right spell and you get the judge to do it. But of course, it's not going to work.
Or it's like the God codes in a video game, right? And his is subject matter jurisdiction.
Exactly. So yeah, they think there's a code there that you can like tap into. Now, so the 14th Amendment. So in a technical, it depends on the level of analysis. So on a technical level, as a libertarian, decentralist, anarchist, skeptic, I believe the 14th Amendment is never ratified properly. So I think it's illegal in the first place. Okay, because it was ratified either under coercion or one or two of the states withdrew their ratification and the Congress refused to recognize that. So I think the 14th Amendment, in some platonic abstract way of looking at it, is actually illegal. It was never ratified. But as a de facto matter, it's clearly the law, just like the Constitution is the law. I mean, you could say the Constitution was illegal because it was a coup in a sense. But at a certain point in time, coups become the de facto law, the legal positivist law. So the 14th Amendment is part of the Constitution. But so then the question is, what's the right way to interpret it? And I think the 14th Amendment is only a fairly modest change in the constitutional structure and doesn't do what everyone says it does. I don't think that it incorporates the Bill of Rights against the states. So I don't think, for example, it ever was unconstitutional for a state to have a law censoring free speech or even establishing a state religion. In fact, that was clearly recognized for the first 100 years of the Constitution. Massachusetts had congregationalism, etc. So the question is, did the 14th Amendment change that? So my view is sort of one that most respectable libertarians like Roger Pilon and Randy Burnett and these guys, Cato types, would hate because they want wishes to be so. They, I agree with Ayn Rand. Wishing doesn't make it so. Even if you want it to be this way, it's just not. Okay. So I don't think that. I think that the slaughterhouse cases in 1890s, whenever the slaughterhouse cases were, I think they were actually correct. I think that the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the Bill of Rights was very limited and restricted, and it was vague. And because it was vague, you have to construe it narrowly, because not because we're against construing rights grants broadly, but because we're against construing a change of the federalist system broadly, like and eroding the federalist limitation on federal power. So I don't think the Privilege and Immunities Clause did very much. So then when the court turned to the Due Process Clause later on to start incorporating the Bill of Rights, it was obviously bullshit, which is, I think, what the court recently finally found in the Roe versus the Dobbs case, right?
Yeah.
Dobbs case. So so I think the 14th Amendment is illegitimate, and I think it was narrow, and I think it was bad. And if I could get rid of it, I would get rid of it. I would get rid of it. I'm not going to make
you would throw a bomb in a lot of it.
I'm not going to make a politically correct joke here, but I would get rid of a lot of the amendments.
Gotcha. 19 is what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
Andy, you want me to read some of these questions you had sent me for?
Well, I can fire away at some.
Okay.
I think we did a fairly decent job on some of the Magness stuff and Stephan's.
I could keep playing some of the video, but everyone could go to your Substack actually and break it down. I just think he was dishonest in saying if you're the heir and you're I don't think you're misreading it all. You can deviate a little bit from the other person and not be a white nationalist. Anyway, sorry, Andy, go.
I think maybe Elon Musk can do a Mises AI avatar and have him come on stage and answer the questions and tell us who he agrees with, Magness or Hoppe.
Right.
I was going to ask you, what do Hoppe's critics get right?
Wow.
Well, I would say that there is legitimate debate on the argumentation ethics defense of individual rights. Okay, that's a promising field for exploration and debate and development, and some of the criticisms are well-meaning. Not all, but some.
Have you taken his argument though further? I mean, his philosophy on the argumentation ethics. Haven't you kind of expanded on that?
Yeah.
So is yours kind of the critique then?
No, I think I built on it. I said that he has a compliment. He had a good insight about how the structure of argumentation works and what it means in general. But I tried to put it in more of a legalistic framework, being a lawyer, like thinking about the actual context of rights claims. So I think, no, I just compliment what he did.
We have a question here. He and Hoppe argue that the body is inalienable and that voluntary slavery is impossible. If this is so, how much will wannabe slaves have to pay for defrauding slave buyers? Does that make sense?
Yes. That sounds a little bit like the type of argument Walter Block tries to make when he defends the ability and the right to engage in voluntary slavery contracts. And that's by the way, this is a very, very, very interesting question. Although in a sense, it's an irrelevant question because this is like, let the libertarians answer the question about something that will never happen in society. Yeah, right. I don't think we're going to actually
be on the record against slavery or something like that.
Yeah, I don't think we're actually going to have people signing actual slavery contracts, but if you want to ask us, okay, if we have to answer, what do we predict would be the response of a libertarian legal system to the enforceability of such an arrangement, right? That's the real question, right? And what this guy is implying, so his question I think is well-intentioned, but it's loaded and it's question begging, probably unintentionally, because he says the word fraud there. So what he's assuming is that he's assuming a certain view of contracts and property and fraud. So he's assuming that if you promise to be a slave and you back out on the contract, then you're defrauding someone of something. I don't know, their obligation, their right, their property, something. But you see how that's question begging because it's like, well, yeah. if you own me and I don't comply with your wishes, then I'm stealing your property from you, which is me. But if your only argument that I'm doing that is because I promised it, and if I don't fulfill the promise, it's fraud. Then that's just a complicated way of just restating your assumption. Like it's so. I guess so. My basic answer would be, it's not fraud. So fraud is, and again, so this requires another rethinking of the entire. So it all is based upon the fundamentals and the foundations, which is property rights and law emerges and arises because of the fundamental fact of scarcity and the possibility of conflict. So the whole function of property rights is to assign ownership to things so that we can know who owns it, so people can avoid conflict. That's the whole point of all of this, right? So you can't just throw the word fraud out and say, so libertarians for decades have been sloppy about this because we've had low-hanging fruit and we've been fighting against the status. So we can easily say, oh, we libertarians, we think that everything's permissible except for, the initiation of force and trespass and fraud and threats. So we keep adding these things on to sort of like it's a no-brainer that it's obviously part of the first thing, but it's not so obviously part of it unless you're careful with what you're saying, right? So most people mean the word fraud to just mean being a lying, dishonest asshole, right? Yeah. You told some girl you made a lot of money, you took her on a date, you defrauded her, whatever. You're a fraud. You're a fraud. What does that even mean?
It depends how the date ended, stuff.
Yeah, I know. Well, I'm thinking of my dates in college.
Oh, okay.
But no, it's like, so like you say someone is a fraud. That's a vague term. It just means, I'm not going to say his name because he's very famous and he might sue me, but a certain Bitcoin person I would say is a fraud, if you know what I'm saying. But what does that mean? It means he's a dishonest person. Okay, but there's nothing, I won't say there's nothing wrong with being dishonest, but there's nothing rights violating about being dishonest, right, per se. So you can't say that someone violates the non-aggression principle or violates rights just because they were a fraud, if by fraud you just mean they were dishonest. So what fraud really means is, in my view, the only coherent core of the fraud idea that you can anchor in non-aggression is what I call implicit theft. And so that just follows from property rights and contracts. Yeah. So property rights means I'm the legitimate owner of this thing for these reasons. I'm the first one to use it, or I got it by contract from someone else, right? But that by itself implies that I can transfer it to someone consensually or voluntarily, right? Consensually. If it's not consensual, then it's not a legitimate transfer. So if you coerce me, you threaten me to do it, that's not consensual. And likewise, if you misrepresent the terms of what you're doing for me in return, it's also not consensual. It's sort of like the idea of informed consent for surgery or something like that. So I think fraud has to be anchored in this idea of informed consent, and theft by trick, basically, is what the common law calls it, theft by trick. But if you understand that, theft by trick only refers to things that are, you're stealing an owned resource that we already agree is owned. So you can't use the idea of fraud to justify ownership of a body that's transferable, because that's what's sought to be justified, right? So if I promise to be your slave, the question is, can you use force against me if I don't obey your orders, right? And to me, the answer is simply no, because if you use force against me, you're committing aggression. Well, so
that's not a remedy for contracts, right? I mean,
well, that's the other thing. So that's the other thing. People think of I actually think there should be no remedies for contracts, because contracts should not be thought of as binding obligations where breach is possible and then you have to remedy. Like, I actually think the entire conceptual framework is wrong and confused.
Well, then that gives me to my next question, which is contract law, current contract law, or how you might even perceive it, is that in alignment with libertarian values? And then if yes or no, so I do family law, that's all I do. And so if we were going to go to private courts as an example, how would we deal with this with contracts? And as Andy actually had asked me to put on here, what would your children parental rights look like, i.e. family courts in a private legal system?
Now, see, that's actually a very, I think, fascinating question. So I think that for most private commercial law, the Rothbardian and Kinsella view of contracts differs from the way the modern system works in very few respects, very, very minor. But it does have greater and greater effects. I mean, because we don't have debtors. If we had debtors prison, I would say it has a big effect, but we don't have debtors prison anymore. Not exactly, although
and even specific performance isn't really a.
Yeah, you don't have specific performance, and you don't have debtors prison. So in that respect, basically the system is basically my system. They just don't know it, But it could make a difference when it comes to things like family law, which is very interesting. And I've done a little family law, and actually it's one of my favorite parts of law. I love that
hate
stuff.
It. That's so. So I actually have an engineering degree, and I always wanted to do what you do, and I do what I do, and I mean it makes money. So
I like doing name changes and adoptions and wills and all that stuff. I liked it.
Yeah. Anyway.
But anyway,
I've just been the one drugged through there.
Yeah, I would Andy, you could be my client if I lived in Texas. Sorry.
Well, so I think that you would have to recharacterize and recast all this stuff in a libertarian framework if you wanted to figure out what the right result is. Now, I do tend to think that the default rules in family law, and by family law I mean marital property law, divorce law, separation of estates, alimony. I think that they tend to be roughly justifiable by a private way that I would recast everything, but it would take a lot of work, and I haven't done that.
Well, so that's something Andy and I are. He's been involved in the system. He's very passionate about that, and that's something I do. So we're trying to, in a sense, figure things out. My problem is I'm deep in the system of every day, the nuts and bolts of.
Yeah.
Your mic cut out, Tyler. I can't hear you.
So it's not just me. All right. Tell me some stories about Tyler.
he's a professional bicyclist too. Yeah.
Professional what?
Still alive. He's a professional bicyclist as well. But him and I've been on through family law system and custodial court, and it's interesting talking to him about it. Obviously, I would abolish the state monopoly on courts, but what would private custodial law look like? I think there are advantages to the competition of courts.
Yes, but the thing is, are you talking about like a divorce or something like that, child support and all that?
Yeah.
I mean, no system is going to make that situation nice, right? I mean,
yeah,
you can't really blame the system for the problem. The only question is, how does it respond to it? And of course, if you give the parents more agency in making decisions ahead of time that the system has to respond to, then you think that a lot of these things would be, you get married, you say, listen, here's the regime we're going to agree to live by.
Yeah, I think with my experience with it, it tends to negotiate conflicts up rather than down as it is today. So like what would be more preferable outcomes, especially when it seems like a lot of the incentives drive people to further entrench conflict.
Yeah, and I think that's primarily because the government runs it and they're just not that good at it.
Yeah.
Tyler, you're still
okay. I got a couple of other quick questions I'll ask you if you still got a few minutes.
Sure.
I was going to say, how does estoppel complement argumentation ethics?
Well, I think it sort of changes the focus. So Hoppe talks about more the abstract requirements of argumentation in general, but I focus on I imagine more like a court situation where like people are actually,
Hello?
You're back.
Gotcha.
I don't know what happened. Sorry, guys.
We're talking about estoppel. I assume we're still recording.
Yes, it's been going on without me. This is how this show is run, so no problem.
Are you really real?
Well, my wife seems to think I am at times. So yeah, go ahead. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt this show.
I was just talking briefly about the estoppel stuff. I think it sort of helps flesh out some issues that Hans doesn't directly address. Like for example, the way I talk about estoppel, I talk about proportionality of punishment, because that's what someone could argue when they're trying to object to being punished, like in a real context. So like I say that, well, if you've committed this kind of crime, you have no ground to stand on to complain about being punished proportionally because you've done that. But if the victim wants to go beyond that, you do have a ground because you haven't done what they weren't proposed to do to you, right? So it sort of helps put meat on the bones, and I think the estoppel context helps solve like one problem which a lot of critics of the free market have argued, which is the billionaire problem, which is like, oh, well, if you just put a fixed value on everyone's life, then a Bill Gates could kill like 1,000 people and get away with it with impunity because he could just pay $3 million to all the heirs of the people he killed and he could just get away with it, right? But in my system, it's more Austrian, it's more subjective. There's no objective value of human life. It simply recognizes that the victim or the victim's heirs have a right to proportional punishment. So if you're a billionaire and you commit an act of murder, then the victim's heirs could theoretically kill you in return, right? It'd be a just proportionate punishment. And so they could use that right to threaten you, to bargain you, to, if I'm worth $100,000, I might pay you $90,000 to avoid being killed. But if I'm worth $1 billion, I might pay $990 million to avoid being killed. So it was sort of solved the billionaire problem. So I think it sort of adds more color and nuance and context to the whole framework of thinking about what rights we have.
Hasn't Bernie Sanders been trying to solve the billionaire problem?
Yeah, getting rid of billionaires.
Right.
Except for the government, right? The government's always going to be a billionaire.
Yeah, exactly. So, look, I know you said an hour. We'll let you go, but I did have a few. Maybe someday you could come back again. One of the big questions I have with an attorney is the Alex Jones. Obviously, you went to head toe-to-toe with Hornberger on this. I've looked into it some. I am baffled with the civil procedure issue that they would do a kind of the kill shot of default on someone. Now, I understand, what can happen if you're not following the rules of civil discovery, right? And I don't know. I hear Barnes out there talking like, Jones did everything possible, but I am a little skeptical only because two jurisdictions seem to be in cahoots to do this. Doesn't mean that I'm in agreement at all with defamation laws and or the judgment. Okay, so I'm not with Hornberger on any of those. I'm just a little bit curious. Do you know, and I haven't been able to find the pleadings, do you know anything about the specifics on default with that?
No, I didn't follow the details of it because I was just interested in the sort of broader picture. I will say that lots of people, it's sort of like when I talk about intellectual property, people don't really understand the law that they're talking about and they blend things together. Like they'll say, oh, if you're against copyright, I guess you're in favor of plagiarism. It's like, well, plagiarism and copyright are different, and trade secret is different than patents, and patents are different than trademarks. And so it is possible that I didn't follow the details, but if Alex Jones actually incited a mob to go harass some families and they physically did that, I could see a case being made under libertarian law for him being liable, like incitement. So I've written about this in my causation piece with Pat Tinsley. So speech can sometimes lead to liability. If you incite a mob, I think you're guilty. And the way that you can see that is imagine you're a Jewish maid cleaning up Hitler's headquarters during World War II,
Okay.
and your family's in the concentration camp, and one night you're dusting around his desk, and you got the ability to pick up a letter opener and stab him in the neck and kill him, right? And save your family, right? Would you be justified? Now, I know some of these pacifist retard libertarians say no, but maybe she'd be forgiven. It's like, no, she's actually taking out a threat to her family. And the reason he's a threat is because he has the authority to make speech and sounds that would lead to her family being killed, right?
Yeah.
Right. So the context matters a lot. So sometimes the ability to do things that harm people. But my understanding is the Alex Jones case had nothing to do with that. Everyone says that. It's, oh, Alex Jones made all these people harass. It's like, well, I don't think. My understanding is the causes of action was primarily defamation, which again is unjust. And what was the other one? It was
well, in Connecticut, they used like a consumer protection type of law, or yeah. So I don't know.
Which is similar. So it's probably reputation rights based or something like that. Right? You've harmed someone's reputation, which. Actually, from what I know about defamation law, I think it's all bullshit because I don't think that these parents' reputation was harmed. No. They might have been harassed, but again, that's a different cause of action, which I don't think was the basis of this suit. Do you think anyone in the country thinks that these parents were really false flags or whatever the hell he claimed? I don't think anyone believes that. So their reputation has literally not been harmed. Their feelings have been hurt. That's true, but that's not what defamation law is based upon. So I think it's crazy. I have a feeling he might win on appeal, but I don't know. I mean, it's devastating.
All I can imagine is when the plaintiffs filed to have this done by default because he wasn't following the guidelines for civil procedure. His response should timestamp everything out of what they've produced and whatnot, and that would be helpful. I can't find that, but I'm sure it's
he might have made a mistake in not complying with the system because he's again. Just like your common law court nut friends,
Yeah, your sovereign. He's a
sovereign citizen,
right? Well, anyway, we'll let that go. There's so much we can more talk. Andy, did you have any? Oh, before we go though, I did want to make sure I got this question in. What's the best kind of Hoppe book or maybe article for someone who hasn't really read him and wants to get into Hoppe?
Well, if it's a book, I would read A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism.
Okay.
But if it's something shorter, I would start with his article in Libertarian Papers. It's on his website, hanshoppe.com. I think it's called A Rationale for Total Privatization, something like that. But it's in Libertarian Papers about 8 years ago. That's a good kind of precise overview of his approach to political theory.
All right, Andy, what do you have for Mr. Kinsella before we head out? Now you're muted.
Oh, sorry. I coughed a minute ago. I got a few quick ones. Have you written anything about and more of long form of your skepticism of Hoppe's covenant communities, and where can that be found?
No, I've never written much about it. I guess my skepticism would be in the idea that it would be what people think of it as. Like, it wouldn't be 100% unanimous homeowners association where everyone that's within a certain geographic territory would be bound. I think there'd be enough of it where it could have tendencies. And I also personally am a little bit skeptical. I think I'm a little bit more of a cosmopolitan and a modernist than Hans is. I think it's fine to live among a diverse group of people, and I think that would probably tend to be the model of any future society that's successful, if we can escape this wokeism bullshit, right? So like it's like I want us to get rid of religion, but not by adopting the other religion. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
that's kind of my view. Is it possible? I don't know. I don't see why it's not possible. So in my utopian society, we would have not really covenant communities. You would just have different areas, and they would tend to be secular, cosmopolitan, diverse, multicultural. But it would, of course, be heterosexual based and with people having kids, and that would be the predominant mode of society because that's the way the human race procreates itself. I mean, yeah, you can have gay people and whatever running around. That's okay.
Yeah, people, even more homogenous cultural enclaves tend to venture out and trade with people outside of their enclaves.
Yeah, and even live among each other. I mean, you go to Israel now, there's Palestinians there. You go to some Arab countries, there's a few Jewish pockets, and there's white groups in the other countries and black groups in these countries and Hispanic here and there and Chinatown. I mean, I don't see anything wrong with that, and you can't predict it, and you shouldn't want to steer it. But I tend to think the phenomena would be more people that don't follow the rules and that are social misfits and outcasts and that are basically intolerant assholes. They're going to tend to find life increasingly unpleasant, and they're not going to be able to succeed. So they'll just be winnowed out by the market process. So that's how I view it. And I think that's sort of the end result of this Hoppian covenant community idea. But I don't really think you'll have conservative covenant community here with a bunch of Mormons and all white land here and Hispanic land here. I really don't think that's the future of humanity, and I don't know if Hans thinks that either.
No, not in a big expanse for the most part. I mean, you mentioned the Mormons. There was, I don't know if you've seen this show on Netflix, Keep Sweet, Pray, and something. It's about the fundamentalist Mormons, Latter-day Saints. Pretty fascinating. But Andy, besides that, did you have anything else?
Two last real quick
Jesus.
ones. Is libertarianism a legal, ethical, or moral theory, or a blend?
It's meta-ethical in that it's a series of norms about what laws we should have. So it's sort of meta-ethical / legal. It's not directly moral, except insofar as a moral philosopher wants to argue that that there's a default presumption that rights violations are immoral, but that's beyond my pay grade. So I think it's more like it's a set of norms telling us what laws we should have.
My last question is way off topic. I just wanted to ask this one for fun: is who is your favorite rapper?
I don't know, Eminem.
Oh, I hate it.
Nice.
Stephan, thanks. You and Scott Horton, the two big intellectuals that I didn't get a chance to meet at Reno. Next time I'm around some of these, I'll definitely try to hook up. So we appreciate you coming on. Anything you want to plug, upcoming events or anything that's before we head out?
I got nothing. Just follow me on the normal channels.
All right. And Garbage Main, Andy?
Go watch Kinsella's recent talk at the PFS. It's really good. And check out hoppian.org.
There you go. So people, if you check back into this, you're going to find some nuggets. One, I think Stephan called Bob Murphy a retard.
No, I don't think so.
Oh, he's a pacifist. And then there's some bigwig Bitcoiner he doesn't like. I got it into one too. I called him a liar, and he came after me.
It may be the same one.
I love Bob. I love Bob. He knows that.
Off air, tell me who your Bitcoin guy is. I'll tell you mine, and then we'll go. Thank you very much. Appreciate your intellect and to coming on here with us. Hang on just a second. We'll talk to you backstage. It's going to be an extra long, unnecessary outro. Thank you, everybody, for coming on and watching. Check us out everywhere we are and like us and just subscribe. Thanks.
Okay, I'm leaving now. Bye, guys.
But she's back.
And now.
Chick-fil-A is completely overrated. It's not that good. I prefer Zaxby's. I prefer Popeyes.
Takes a tough man to make a tender forecast, Nick. And I guess that's me. Keep fucking that chicken.
Should I vote for Dick Cheney on the Libertarian Party? Do I have an obligation to vote for Dick Cheney?
I would say so.
Yes.
Did it work for those people?
No, it never does. I mean, these people somehow delude themselves into thinking it might, but it might work for us.
That one dude was like, not a podcast, I can't find it anywhere, and they don't have video.
Oh, yeah, Peter Janke, yeah.
Yeah, I blocked him.
I'll do it. If he unblocks me, I'll...
He'll buy your shirt if you unblock him, Bert.
He's a wigger.
Yeah, nothing cooler than a 49-year-old wigger. I just started live streaming. Cut me some slack. I'm pretty high tech for a boomer. But anyways,
boomer.